Henry always knew fear. It wasn't the kind that came from the dark or the monsters under his bed. It was the kind that lived inside the walls, the kind that whispered at night when no one else could hear. At first, his parents thought it was just his imagination, childhood anxieties, nothing more. But Henry knew the truth, and soon, so would they. It started with a door that wouldn't stay shut, with objects moving from where they had been left. Then came the footprints, too large to be his, too small to be Adam's. And then the whispers, soft, careful, slipping through the cracks in the night. Promises made to someone who wasn't supposed to be there. By the time Adam and Emily realized that something was terribly wrong, it was too late. The walls of their home held a secret far more terrifying than they ever imagined, because the man who had been watching them wasn't just a stranger. He had always been there, waiting, and Charlotte, their innocent baby girl, was the reason he had stayed. Stay with us until the end, because once you hear the final truth, you'll never look at your own home the same way again. Henry sat on the floor beside Charlotte's crib, his small hands clutching the edge as he peered through the wooden bars. His breathing was shallow, his wide eyes locked on the darkened hallway beyond the nursery door. The dim glow from the nightlight barely reached the doorway, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. Emily had been watching him for several nights now, silently observing from the hallway, hoping that whatever was keeping her son awake would eventually pass. But tonight, as she stood hidden near the staircase, she heard him whisper, his voice barely more than a breath. "I promise I won't let him take you," he murmured to Charlotte, his fingers tightening around the crib's frame. A chill ran down Emily's spine. It wasn't just the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the way he said them, as though he truly believed them, as though he had seen something she hadn't. At first, Adam had dismissed Henry's behavior as nothing more than childish imagination. "He's adjusting to having a sister," he had said when Emily expressed concern. "It's normal for kids to act out when a new baby arrives." But this wasn't acting out. Henry wasn't throwing tantrums or seeking attention. He wasn't jealous or resentful. If anything, he was protective, always hovering near Charlotte, refusing to leave her side even for a moment. And then there were the places he avoided. Emily had noticed how he hesitated before stepping into the hallway leading to Charlotte's room, how he would dart past it as if something unseen lurked in the shadows. She had tried to coax an explanation out of him, had sat beside him and asked gently, "Henry, why don't you like the hallway?" But he would only shake his head, his lips pressed into a firm, pale line. "I just don't," he would mutter, pulling the covers over his head, as if that would shield him from whatever it was that terrified him. It wasn't until that night, when Henry appeared in their room, trembling, his face drained of all color, that Adam finally took notice. The boy stood in the doorway, his small frame barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, and his fingers dug into the fabric of his pajama top. "He was there," Henry whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Emily sat up immediately, her heart pounding. "Who, sweetheart?" she asked, already reaching for him, pulling him into the bed between her and Adam. "Who was there?" Henry swallowed hard, his little hands gripping the blanket as if afraid to let go. "The man," he choked out. "The man from the hallway. He was standing by Charlotte's crib." Adam exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I'll check," he said, his tone filled with the same quiet reassurance he used whenever Henry woke up from a nightmare. But Emily could see the hesitation in his movements, the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the blanket before he finally stood. Henry watched him go, his body tense, his gaze locked onto the doorway as if expecting something or someone to step through it at any moment. Emily wrapped her arms around him, whispering soothing words against his hair, but she could feel how rigid he was beneath. Her touch, how his breathing didn't slow, how his little hands refused to unclench. Adam flicked on the nursery light, his eyes scanning the room with careful precision. Everything was as it should be. The crib was undisturbed, the rocking chair motionless in the corner, the curtains drawn against. The night. He moved closer, peering over the crib's edge at Charlotte's sleeping form, his fingers grazing the soft fabric of her onesie. Nothing was out of place. He sighed, shaking his head as he turned back toward the door. "Henry," he called gently, "there's nothing here, just your imagination." "Buddy," but Henry didn't respond. He was still staring at the doorway, his lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. "He was there," he whispered again, as though Adam's words hadn't reached him. His little body trembled against Emily's side, and when she reached down to take his hand, she could feel the rapid, uneven pulse beneath his skin. Adam hesitated, his brow furrowing as he stepped back into the room, his gaze shifting toward the hallway beyond. He had never believed in ghosts or premonitions, never put stock in the idea that children could see things adults couldn't. But Henry's fear was real. It clung to him like a second skin, an invisible force pressing down on his small frame. And when Adam turned off the nursery light and started back toward the bedroom, a strange, nagging sensation crept up his spine. For the briefest of moments, as he passed the hallway, mirror, he could have sworn he saw something move in the reflection. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket as her eyes snapped open. Something wasn't right. A subtle, nagging feeling sat heavy in her chest, like a whisper at the back of her mind, urging her to move. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she turned toward Adam, who was breathing evenly. Beside her, undisturbed, the room was still cloaked in darkness, the faint glow from the hallway nightlight barely spilling through the slightly ajar bedroom door. That's when she noticed it. Down the hall, the door to Charlotte's nursery was open. Not wide open, but just enough for a sliver of blackness to stretch into the corridor. Her heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. She was sure, absolutely sure, that she had closed it before going to bed. She always did. It had become a habit, a small reassurance that Charlotte was safe. But now it stood slightly open, an invitation into something she wasn't ready to face. She sat up, slowly peeling the covers off, her feet hesitating before touching the floor. The hardwood was cool beneath her steps as she crossed the room and nudged Adam's shoulder. "Adam," she whispered, keeping her voice low as if speaking too loudly might wake something. "Unseen," he grumbled, shifting slightly but not waking. Frustrated, she shook him again, firmer this time. "Adam, wake up!" he groaned, rubbing his eyes before blinking up at her in confusion. "What?" His voice was thick with sleep, but she ignored it, pointing toward the hallway. "The nursery door. I closed it before bed. It's open." Adam frowned but didn't move immediately, staring at her as if trying to gauge how serious she was. Then, sighing, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. "Maybe you forgot," he muttered, pushing himself up. Emily shook her head. "I didn't forget." Her voice was more insistent now, and something in her expression must have convinced him, because he stood without further argument, running a hand over his face as he made his way down the hallway. When they reached the nursery, Adam pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The soft hum of Charlotte's steady breathing filled the space, her tiny form peaceful in the crib. Everything appeared normal. No furniture was out of place, no signs of disturbance. He turned back to Emily, raising an eyebrow. "See?" "Nothing." But Emily wasn't looking at Charlotte. She was staring at the door itself, her fingers brushing over the smooth wood. "I know I closed it," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Adam sighed. Maybe it didn't latch properly. But before Emily could respond, a small voice cut through the quiet. "I told you." Both of them turned sharply toward Henry, who stood in the hallway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, dark, cautious, were locked on the nursery. "I told you," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "He comes at night." Adam exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Henry, we've talked about this." He said, his tone laced with exhaustion. "There's no one here. No one is coming for Charlotte." Henry didn't argue. He just stared, unmoving, as if Adam's words didn't matter, as if he already knew they wouldn't believe him. Emily swallowed hard, glancing between them before stepping forward and crouching beside Henry. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "what do you mean by he?" Henry's lips pressed together, his little hands gripping the hem of his pajama shirt. Then quietly he whispered, "The man in the hallway." A chill crept down Emily's spine, and even Adam hesitated before shaking his head. "That's enough," he muttered, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. "It's late. Go back to bed." Henry stiffened at the touch, but nodded, turning on his heel and padding back toward his room. Emily watched him go, uneasy, before glancing back at Adam. "We need to take this seriously," she said, her voice barely audible. Adam looked at her, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes, something dangerously close to doubt. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around the house. Small, almost imperceptible at first, but enough to unsettle Emily. A glass that had been left on the kitchen counter vanished, only to be found later in the living room, without explanation. The baby monitor cut out randomly, replaced by static before returning to normal. Packages of food in the pantry seemed to disappear, though neither she nor Adam could remember using them. Then one afternoon, as Emily was picking up Henry's toys, she noticed something odd near the nursery door. Faint footprints in the dust on the floorboards. They were small, too small for Adam, but too large to be Henry's, and they led directly to Charlotte's crib before vanishing. She stared at them, stared. For a long moment, her pulse hammering in her ears before she called out. "Adam," she said, keeping her voice steady. But he was already beside her, staring at the prince with a furrowed brow. "That's weird," he muttered, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That night, as the storm raged, outside, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy. Rain lashed against the windows, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the darkened rooms for split seconds. Emily found herself lying awake, her mind racing. Then, suddenly, a scream, high-pitched, terrified. "Mom! Dad!" The cry jolted, both of them upright. Emily was already running before she fully registered what was happening, Adam right behind her. When they burst into Henry's room, they found him curled on the floor, sobbing, his entire body shaking. "Henry!" Emily dropped to her knees, pulling him into her arms. "What happened?" But he wasn't looking at her. His teary eyes were locked on Charlotte's crib, his voice broken as he sobbed. "He was here. He was right here." Adam turned toward the nursery, his body tense as he stepped inside. The air felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but something was off. Then he saw it. The window, slightly open, his breath caught. "Did you open this?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Emily turned, eyes widening as she shook her head. "No, I haven't touched it." Adam ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. If Henry was imagining things, then why was the window unlocked? And why, for the first time since this all started, did Adam feel like they weren't alone? Adam sat at the edge of the bed, his laptop balanced on his knees, his face illuminated by the bluish glow of the screen. His fingers hesitated over the trackpad as he exhaled, forcing himself to click play on the footage from the baby monitor. He had been avoiding this moment all day, telling himself that whatever had scared Henry last night was just a child's imagination running wild. But the open window, the footprints, the missing objects, none of it made sense. His heart pounded as the grainy night vision feed flickered to life, showing Charlotte's crib bathed in eerie monochrome light. The room was still, untouched, exactly as he remembered it when he had checked after Henry's screams had woken them. For a while, nothing happened. The minutes ticked by as Charlotte's tiny form shifted in her sleep, her soft breaths the only movement in the frame. Adam let out a slow breath, about to shut the laptop, when something on the screen made his blood run cold. A shadow. It wasn't cast by anything in the room, no shifting curtains, no flickering lights. It moved unnaturally, stretching along the wall, pooling into the corner like ink seeping into fabric. His breath hitched as his eyes flicked to the nursery door, expecting it to open, expecting someone to step inside. But the door never moved. The shadow slithered forward, its shape shifting as it neared the crib. Adam's entire body tensed as a creeping realization clawed at his brain. The shadow hadn't come from the door. It had come from the wall. He rewound the footage, his fingers shaking over the touchpad, watching it again. The same unnatural movement, the same impossible entry. Someone or something had been inside Charlotte's room last night, standing just inches from her crib, and there was no logical way it had entered. His stomach churned as he snapped the laptop shut. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't Henry's overactive imagination. This was real, and whatever it was inside their home. Adam wasted no time. He stormed down the hallway, ignoring the chill creeping up his spine as he pushed open the nursery door. The room looked normal, but now that was precisely what unsettled him the most. He approached the walls, running his hand across the surface, feeling for anything, any crack, any inconsistency. His knuckles rapped against the plaster, the solid thud of drywall meeting. His ears. He moved methodically, tapping, pressing, pausing. Then, there it was, a hollow sound. A section of the wall, just behind Charlotte's crib, gave off a distinctly different resonance. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned toward the bookshelf pushed against the same wall. His hands gripped the edges, pulling it away with a grunt, sending a few picture books tumbling to the floor. Behind it, something he hadn't expected. A seam, a faint outline that shouldn't be there. A hidden panel. Emily appeared at the doorway, Henry lingering just behind her, his eyes wide. Adam, her voice was cautious, laced with growing concern as she watched him press against the panel. The wood shifted, clicking softly as it gave way. A section of the wall creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading into the space between the walls. A wave of stale air rushed out, thick with dust and something else, something human. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, and Henry, staring into the darkness, whispered, "I knew it! He's here!" Adam's throat tightened. He reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight and angling it into the hidden space. The narrow corridor stretched into the darkness, just wide enough for someone to slip through. And inside, nestled between the wooden beams and insulation, was a makeshift sleeping area. A thin, filthy mattress was crammed against the base of the wall. Empty food wrappers littered the space, along with discarded juice boxes and rusted tin cans. A few old, dust-covered toys were piled in a corner, a stuffed rabbit with a missing ear, a wooden truck worn down by years of handling. Emily staggered back, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "Oh my God!" she choked, gripping the doorframe as she stared at the horrifying discovery. "Adam, someone's been living here." Adam didn't respond, his mind reeling as he scanned the small, claustrophobic space. It wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a home, or at least, it had been. He reached down, his fingers brushing against a crumpled newspaper tucked near the mattress. The date on it was nearly a decade old. Whoever had been living here had been doing so for years, unseen, unnoticed, just beyond the walls. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper. Henry had been right all along. Henry didn't move from his spot in the doorway. His gaze was locked on the passage, his expression unreadable. Adam turned to him, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Henry," he said carefully, "have you seen him? The man who stays here?" Henry blinked, his little hands gripping the hem of his shirt. "I don't see him," he murmured, "but I hear him." A deep shudder rolled through Adam's body. He crouched to Henry's level, placing his hands on his son's small shoulders. "What do you mean, buddy?" Henry hesitated, glancing at the open panel as if expecting something to crawl out of the darkness. "At night," he whispered. He talks to Charlotte. Emily let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Adam felt his stomach twist into knots. What does he say? He forced himself to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry's expression darkened. He says he misses her, and that one day she'll come with him. The words sent an electric bolt of fear through Adam's body, a cold certainty that whatever was happening in their home was far worse than he had imagined. He turned back to the passage, his flashlight trembling slightly as he scanned the empty space. It was empty now, but had it always been? Had someone been? Standing just out of sight, watching, waiting? A sharp sound snapped through the silence. A creak, a shift. Not from inside the passage, but from somewhere else in the house. Adam froze, exchanging a look with Emily. They weren't alone. Someone else was here. Adam's hands trembled as he dialed the police, his voice tight with urgency as he relayed everything: Henry's fear, the hidden passageway, the makeshift bed inside the walls. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional, promising that officers were on their way, but Adam barely heard her. His mind was racing, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned to Emily, who was clutching Charlotte to her chest, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the open panel in the nursery wall. Henry stood beside her, gripping her leg, his small frame tense. Adam forced himself to take a breath. They weren't imagining this. Someone had been inside their home, watching, listening, waiting, and worse, he had been doing it for God knows how long. When the officers arrived, their skepticism was evident at first. Break-ins were common, trespassers, squatters, they had seen it all. But as Adam led them to the hidden space behind the nursery, their expressions changed. The dust-covered mattress, the food wrappers, the personal belongings that had no place in this home. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a home within their home. The senior officer, a stocky man with graying hair, crouched near the passage's entrance, running his flashlight along the narrow space. "Whoever was here," he muttered. "He's been here a long time." Emily let out a shaky breath, pressing Charlotte closer. "Do you think he's still inside?" The officer straightened, exchanging a glance with his partner. "We'll do a sweep of the house," he assured her, but his tone held something unsettling. Doubt, as if he already suspected that the intruder was nowhere to be found. The search was thorough, every room, every closet, every crawl space, the attic, the basement, even under the porch. Nothing, no sign of forced entry, no hidden corners revealing a lurking presence. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. But then, one of the officers stationed outside called in over the radio. "You're gonna want to see this." Adam and Emily followed the officers to the front porch, their breath catching as the officer played back security footage from a neighbor's camera. The grainy screen showed a man, a tall, gaunt figure, his face obscured by shadows, slipping out the side of their house. He moved quickly, purposefully, heading toward the woods behind the neighborhood. But that wasn't the worst part. The officer fast-forwarded. A few hours later, before the break of dawn, the figure returned. Same pace, same method, slipping back inside as if he belonged there. Emily's knees buckled, and Adam barely caught her before she collapsed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He was inside while we were sleeping." The officer's expression was grim. "And not just once," he muttered. "We checked other nights. He does this every night." Henry, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, now spoke softly. "I knew it," he murmured. His voice was steady, eerily calm. Adam turned to him, heart pounding. "Henry," he said carefully, "why were you so scared? Why did you keep saying he was here?" Henry hesitated, his small hands tightening into fists. Then finally he spoke. "Because he talked to me at night." A silence fell over them, heavy and suffocating. Emily let out a choked sound, her grip tightening on Charlotte. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's eyes flickered toward the house, then back at his parents. "He used to whisper through the walls," he said. "At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I started staying awake, listening. Adam's stomach twisted. What did he say? Henry hesitated again, glancing at the officers, then back at Adam and Emily. His voice was quieter now, like he was afraid saying the words aloud would make them real. He said Charlotte reminded him of someone he lost. One of the officers, a younger man with sharp eyes, exchanged a look with his partner before speaking. We ran a check on the property records, he said. Before you moved in, the house belonged to a man named Eric Carter. The name meant nothing to Adam, but Emily stiffened. Carter, she echoed. The officer nodded. He lived here with his wife and daughter until the bank took the house, foreclosure. He refused to leave at first, but eventually they got him out. Adam frowned, confused. What does that have to do with... The officer cut him off. His daughter, he said, his voice careful. She died a few months before. They lost the house. The weight of the words settled over them like a heavy fog. Henry, silent for a long time, finally spoke again. That's why he comes back, he whispered. He thinks Charlotte is her. Adam felt sick. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Eric Carter had never left. He had been living in the walls, slipping in and out unseen, watching them. And all this time, he had been whispering to their daughter in the dark. The house still carried the weight of everything that had happened, the walls seeming to close in with the knowledge of what had been lurking just beyond them for years. Adam stood at the threshold of the nursery, staring at the space where the hidden passage had been uncovered. The police had taken Eric Carter away hours ago, but the unsettling presence he had left behind lingered like a shadow. Emily sat in the living room, holding Charlotte close, while Henry sat beside her, unusually quiet, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the couch. The officers were still inside, cataloguing everything Eric had left behind. Adam had hoped that with his arrest they could finally move on, finally feel safe. But then one of the officers called out to him. "Mr. Parker," the man said, stepping forward with a thick folder in his gloved hands. "You're going to want to see this." Adam hesitated before taking the folder, his fingers tense around the edges. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were old and yellowed with time, while others looked more recent. As he flipped through them, his breath caught in his throat. They were all of the same child, a little girl with dark curls and wide, expressive eyes. She couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 in most of them. In some, she was smiling. In others, she was holding a stuffed rabbit, the same rabbit they had found buried in the hidden passageway. Adam felt his stomach twist as he turned to the last photograph in the stack. His grip tightened involuntarily. It was a more recent picture, but the girl was not the same. Or rather, she shouldn't have been, because the face staring back at him was unmistakably Charlotte's. Emily let out a small, sharp breath as Adam handed her the photograph. "No," she whispered, her arms tightening protectively around Charlotte. "That's not possible." But the image was undeniable. The resemblance between Eric Carter's deceased daughter and their baby girl was so striking, it was almost as if she had been reborn. The thought sent a wave of nausea crashing over Emily. He thought she was his, she murmured, her voice barely above her breath. The officer exchanged glances with his partner before speaking again. "That's not all we found," he said, leading them toward the hidden space behind the nursery wall. Adam followed, his muscles tense, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air inside was stale, the dust unsettled from the earlier search. But what the officer pointed to now hadn't been noticed before. A small, tattered notebook sat wedged between the wooden beams. Adam reached for it with shaky hands, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. The ink smudged in places, but the words themselves sent ice down his spine. At first, it was just incoherent ramblings, fragments of thoughts, musings about his home and the people who had invaded it. But then, the words became more focused, more disturbing. She finally came back. One entry read, "I thought I had lost her forever, But she found me again. Adam swallowed hard, turning the page. She doesn't know yet, the next entry said, but I will show her. I will protect her this time. His hands shook as he flipped further, his breath catching on the final page. She finally is. Here, now I can protect her for real. Adam's knees nearly buckled. His mind reeled with the horrific realization Eric hadn't just been hiding in their home, watching them. He had been waiting. He believed Charlotte was his daughter, that she had somehow returned to him, and he hadn't just wanted to be near her. He had wanted to take her, to keep her as his own. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her body trembling as she realized the full weight of it. He wasn't just watching her, she said, her voice cracking. He was planning something. Adam looked down at the journal, bile rising in his throat. The thought of how close they had come, of how easily he could have taken Charlotte in the night, made his stomach turn. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We're running a full background check on him now," he said. "But based on what we found here, it's clear he never moved on after losing his daughter. He convinced himself she was still alive somewhere. And when your family moved in," he trailed off, but they all knew the answer. Eric had seen Charlotte and convinced himself that fate had given him a second chance. Emily clutched Charlotte to her chest, rocking slightly, as if to shield her from the weight of everything that had just been revealed. Henry, who had been silent for so long, finally looked up. His voice was small, hesitant. "I heard him," he whispered. Emily turned to him, her heart aching. "When, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Henry looked down, his fingers curling into his shirt. "At night," he said. He whispered through the walls. "At first, I didn't know who he was talking to, but then I realized." He took a deep breath. He was talking to Charlotte. A cold wave of horror settled over them. "What did he say?" Adam forced himself to ask, though part of him didn't want to know. Henry's gaze flickered toward Charlotte, then back at his father. "He said he missed her," he murmured, "that he wouldn't lose her again." Emily let out a soft, broken sound, her hands trembling. Adam felt something dark and primal rise in his chest, a mixture of rage and fear. He had let this man exist under his roof, breathing the same air as his children, and he had never known. The officers took the evidence, packed up the photographs and the diary, promising to investigate further. But even as they left, even as the doors were locked, and the passage was sealed shut, Adam knew nothing would ever be the same again. The house no longer felt like theirs. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like a reminder of what had been living inside its walls. Eric Carter was gone, but his presence had seeped into the bones of the house, into their lives. Emily sat curled on the couch, Charlotte nestled against her, and Adam stood guard, his eyes locked on the nursery door. And Henry, still gripping his mother's sleeve, whispered one last thing. He said he would come back. This story made us reflect on so many things. And for you, what was the most powerful lesson? Leave your comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Creating stories like this takes time and dedication, and your support makes all the difference in helping us continue bringing more special content. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you in the next video.